All right, here we go. So let's talk about compliance and marketing data. Again, in the digital world, everything around it sort of revolves around data, right? That is our oil, that's the blood that we operate our businesses on. So when you think about GDPR and email, you need to start thinking about where your subscribers are located, right? Because obviously we now have stricter regulations for consent. And the way that it's written in the law is that you have to be, if you're signing up for something as a consumer or the data subject, your consent has to be freely given, specific, informed, unambiguous, and if you do that as a marketer, you have complied with the sign-up. So start to think about, preference centers, onboarding strategies, clear consent, mechanisms, links to your privacy policy. And again, these are just tenets of really permission-based programs, right? If you're the marketer and I log into the program or I opt into the program, I am, as the consumer, going to want to manage my digital relationship to the way that I think it should be managed, right? And if you give the consumer that power and the ability to do that, then you as the marketer will reap the ROI rewards of that individual, right? So it might be, it might be a marathon, meaning, I may convert 3 or 4 or 5 times a year, but it's on my terms as opposed to the opposite way. So start to think about that. And again, if you've got any great sense to get out of here today and go get a tattoo, make sure it says no pre-check boxes, because that's stuff that's going to get people in trouble really quickly. Because again, you could demonstrate non-compliance if I'm forced to opt out of a pre-check box as opposed to opt in. You must provide adequate information on how the data is going to be used, meaning, I'm signing up for this, I'm not signing up for that. I'm signing up for the weekly newsletter and not the monthly newsletter, for example. I want email once a week as opposed to 4 times a month. Again, it gets kind of granular, but these are just real generic questions that I think we should all be thinking about. You've got to allow the user to say no and inform them of possible profiling, right? So profiling is going to be a big one, because I think that's going to be one of those pieces of legislation where you could demonstrate that you bought a pair of shoes, but you didn't want to get, a coat ad, or you didn't want to get, another piece of clothing, right? And so that's where I think marketers have to be a little bit sensitive in terms of how these customers are logging in, what they're going to get, when they're going to get it, and essentially the ability to manage that relationship with the brand directly, right? The burden of proof for the consent relies with all of us on the phone here. If we can't show consent, we have no backup, then we're in non-compliance, right? And the question that came up earlier about existing data, it does apply to all existing data. So as we talked about a moment ago, do you re-permission your files now? And then you need to start thinking about creating geo-specific sign-up processes, right? So one of the questions I got asked last week is, we have customers that come to our website from Europe, but they don't sign up for anything. Do I need to be GDPR compliant, right? Well, if they're not signing up for anything and they're just visiting your website, then the answer is no, right? But if they are signing up for stuff and you're saying things back to them, then and you're collecting data on them, then you need to start to think about how that's going to be looking from a regulatory perspective. Should you get into that conversation?
A question that we had come in, David, is asking about how does this apply to like social media and messaging?
That's a great question. So, in a sense, all things are based on consent, right? So if you don't have consent from someone to share information or disclose what you're going to do with information, then you're going to get into hot water a little bit, right? And you're beginning to see that, I think, of some of the activities that you've seen around Facebook recently, within the European Union, the right to be forgotten. I mean, they had 4.5, I think Google had 4.5 million requests for the right to be forgotten for their tracking. I think you're going to start to see more management consoles and the ability for a user to manage their distribution of data. And I think it's going to be a Facebook that's going to take it on the chin initially for all of us, because they've been in the crosshairs of the regulators for many years now. So I think, it's the same kind of concept of like forward to a friend of an email, right? Do you need to consent to forward an email to somebody, and does that email have to be compliant? Well, now it does, and now you have to have consent to do it. So I think it's making us all look at the programs that we run and say, okay, well, does this make sense? Have I built privacy by design, which is a tenet of GDPR? Have I built that into my social media activity, for example, right? Or have I built that into my email campaign? Or have I built that into my SMS tracking, or whatever the case may be? So, I think there's still early stages of how that's going to shake out, but there will be cases around that, right? Like over here, you have things like, hey, I'm scraping LinkedIn for email addresses. Well, is that CAN spam compliant? Well, no, but scraping an email address on LinkedIn to build a file is not necessarily a best practice, but it's not. There have been cases recently where that's been disclosed as not being legal, but not being illegal, right? So it's kind of in the gray area. So I just don't really know what's going to happen in terms of long term. But I do say if you do have, again, a social media strategy within your program, you need to start thinking about if you're disclosing consent or if you're not disclosing consent, because that, again, is low-hanging fruit. So, yeah, I hate to be vague on some of these things, but we just don't know what's going to happen, right? And that's kind of like any law that goes into play. When lawsuits come, they'll go through the court process, and we as all marketers will learn a lot more about, what our obligations are going to be moving forward. But it's going to take that kind of activity for us to really get a good understanding of that. I mean, the GDPR is 99 chapters of legislation. There's 99 articles of legislation. There's 173 recitals based on the interpretation of those articles. So, we're just talking about one of them today, right? So it is a deep and wide concept. So let's talk about GDPR on your website. There is a statement under the privacy fact sheet. Users must be in control of any privacy-sensitive information stored on their devices without having to click on a banner asking for their consent on cookies each time they visit a website. Browser settings are often an easy way to allow to refuse cookies. So you can see when I talked about the e-privacy directive earlier, the cookie consent, and cookie management is mentioned directly in the GDPR legislation. So it's only a matter of time before we start to see the convergence of those two channels in terms of how, if I'm utilizing that technology for my program, how it's going to relate to privacy and privacy management. So it's still early days on that. As I said, mentioned in Recital 30, it's clearly stated that natural persons may be associated with online identifiers such as Internet Protocol addresses, cookie identifiers, other identifiers. So in the EU moving forward, things like IP addresses, cookie identifiers, etc., are what's called PII, right? Personal Identifiable Information. So it's going to get really granular in terms of identifying people based on this type of digital footprints. Any cookie or identifier uniquely attributed to a device and therefore capable of identifying an individual or treating them as a unique even without identifying them as personal data. So, the law has been, the gauntlet has been thrown down, right, in terms of what's on the crosshairs of permission. And, we don't think of PII over here as an IP address. We don't think PII as a cell phone identifiable code, right? But they do in Europe. So that's going to have an impact on how we continue to market it once this whole thing is actually been fleshed out. Let's talk a little about marketing automation and GDPR, and this is just a couple of things a couple of slides that we talk about here. But in terms of being able to comply, right? One of the things that's really prevalent is list maintenance, and that should be a tenet of any kind of program, list maintenance hygiene. And as you can see, using the app-on platform, you can do that within the app itself, right? In terms of managing your unsubscribes, opt-in and opt-out tracking, communication permissions, given subscribers' requirements. So again, if someone knocked on the door and said, "Hey, look, show me my my communication preferences or show my opt-in status, and you can provide this backup, then you have attempted to comply with GDPR, right? So you definitely have that in-app. Adaptive forms, again, the ability to inform new subscribers what they are signing up for and obtain express consent to communicate. So on this particular example, there's me. I'm in Canada, for example, so you know that if you're a Canadian marketer, then you need to be concerned with Castle, but that could be Germany, that could be France, whatever the case may be. As you can see, my box is not pre-checked, and obviously that will take you to the, as you sign up, you get some permission, and you'll be able to do that from an adaptive form perspective. Segmentation is another way to be able to demonstrate consent and marketing automation, and obviously it allows your contact to be opted into list A, not necessarily list B. I'm getting certain things, and being able to set my preferences appropriately as it relates to me being the consumer in terms of my particular move, my particular example or expectations moving forward. And then finally, list management, right? You can identify and pull accounts that have not opted in a separate list for account-based marketing outside of the inbox. Meaning, hey, you don't want email, that's fine, but I can send you a letter and figure out, what your preferences might be moving forward as you start to go down that road. So, think about just using this technology to ensure or being able to attempt to comply with consent, right? Because consent is the key, as I said earlier, the key to any digital relationship, and that's really where the rubber meets the road. So just a few examples there of how Act-On can provide that to you.